Welcome to part one of our video lectures. We're going to kind of go back a little bit and try to bring this all together to make this as smooth as possible. I'm titling this video Industrial Society with a subtitle of Increased Economy, Production Methods, and Scientific Management. That's going to be the focus of our discussion today. What we're continuing to do is to work on these three questions, or in the last two classes we continued to harp that the focus of our discussions were really on this first question of what innovations in technology and business practices helped launch vast increases in industrial production in the post-Civil War period. But our discussion, as it continues to grow, is also going into questions 2 and 3, which is how did the Industrial Revolution affect production, profits, and business processes? You can see these questions tend to weave and overlap. And then last, we're going to ask questions like how were Andrew Carnegie and John Rockefeller and other corporate leaders able to dominate their rivals and consolidate control over their industry? So all three of these questions then move into what we're trying to address and what we've been trying to talk about, which is this focused on increased economy, right? What we talked about, we visited the railroad industry, we visited the steel industry, and what we saw is that American businesses were growing. They were growing not only in size and scope and scale, but in trying to grow into these big behemoth of machines that were more and more efficient at the process of production, which has a couple of effects. It lowers production costs, it lowers prices for the cost of something, for say a product. So when you can produce televisions for cheaper, you can sell them for cheaper. But that doesn't mean that you actually lessen your profits either. You can lower production costs, lower prices, and still increase your profits. And this is what we're talking about with a focus on increased economy. So when we think about what the focus of business was in the late 20th century, we really need to come back and revisit this idea over and over: increased economy. So what does that ultimately mean? One English observer said this: the American manufacturer is not so conservative in his methods and ideas. What he's saying is he's willing to take risk. He's willing to invest a lot of money up front. But his decisions, regardless of the trouble, that means the headache, the cost, that is the investment, or interference with preconceived ideas, kind of like tradition, this is how we've always done it, invested interests rested in one chief consideration: whether they would make for increased economy. And so what that means is that despite any of these challenges, all decisions were made as, does this help the bottom line in doing a couple of things: lowering production costs, increasing productivity, and ultimately increasing the scale of your profits and the size of your business. We continue to see this vision in this statement from Andrew Carnegie, who is the poster child of the industrial world and really the American dream, a Scottish immigrant who comes to America with nothing and is able to work his way up into being the richest man in the world, right? Andrew Carnegie kind of lived and died, at least that is what we are told by this message. At least that's what he wrote in his Gospel of Wealth. Watch costs and the profits will take care of themselves. So again, you can see how that statement really focuses on his attitude about increased economy. It's not about trying to raise the cost or the price that you're going to sell it to the consumer or whatever company maybe that was buying steel for him. It's how can we make steel cheaper? And if we can make steel cheaper for ourselves, like the investment cost of that, we will profit in the end. It will follow. Charles Schwab, his protege, said this: Carnegie never wanted to know the profits. He always wanted to know the cost. And you can see this in this number right here. I've pulled some statistics on what it cost to produce a ton of steel. In 1878, it took $35.52 per ton. That's how much Carnegie Steel had in each ton of steel. So if they sold it for 50, they made 35 or 14.48. But by 1898, this same company was able to find a way to produce that same amount of steel for $12 per ton. Again, a focus on increased economy. Now, we've talked about some strategies with business and how they're able to do this. I'm not going to overly rehash these ideas because we've spent so much of time in this class on this, but again, try to relate these ideas of how they relate to that concept of an increased economy. Remember, increased economy is trying to lessen production costs and increase productivity with the eye of expanding your business and profits in the end. So you could do this through two strategies that we've discussed. Again, you know this, you've taken notes on this. Economies of scope, and that is how can we diversify our business processes to lessen production costs and ultimately enhance our net, right, within our niche. We talked about this maybe if Apple could find a way to use the same processor in multiple different computers. They don't need an individual one type of processor per computer, per model. So that way they can produce a million of those and try to produce those efficiently, effectively, and then use those and integrate those into a variety of products rather than having one specific processor for each device. You can do this through economies of scope. Another idea would be this is while you're making steel beams, maybe you could take that opportunity to also make steel widgets at the same time, right? It's got to do with scope, has to do with productivity and also broadening that net of sales. Probably the easier one to understand, however, is scale, and that is this is the story of really the industrial era. And if you look at what we've talked about with how you were trying to produce steel during this period, you've watched videos on this, is that the more we do this in volume, the more we can lessen the costs and ultimately increase the profits. For instance, my wife and I, since we've been at home and kind of stuck inside, been cooking a lot, and my wife loves quiche, and we made these pie crusts to make these quiche. Well, we made 4, right? And when you make 4, it took that time and that energy. But what if we could have made 360? And yes, that would have taken more time. It would have cost us more money in the immediacy, more flour, more butter, right? But if we could buy a 50-pound bag of flour where we get that at a reduced cost rather than that small bag, or if we could buy, 150 sticks of butter, do we get a discount on that? So this is increased volume brings back these returns in a variety of ways. So moving on, we continue to talk about ways to do this in class, whether it be innovations and technological investment. We've seen how Bessemer Steel is a great example of how you can try to integrate a technology, and that is not do it the old way, but try to find new, innovative ways that reduce time, that reduce cost, that increase productivity. We've discussed other things like automation and mechanization. And that is, how can you continue to streamline this process to speed up production, right? Increase productivity and reduce production costs, right? So these are ideas we've all revisited. And also, you can see this as businesses developed in that development of a systematic management structure where you really put people in place where their entire job is to continue to monitor the progress of the employees, the processes, and to continue to reduce waste, increase productivity, and increase efficiency in an effort to increase economy. When we left off in our last class, too, we were discussing another strategy that has to do with how companies can ultimately increase economy. And that is what happens when you get so good at it you can't get any better. What happens when you got the discounts on the butter or the discount on the flour from Sam's and you really can't get any better? How can you continue to try to increase economy through various business strategies? And this is where we saw Andrew Carnegie was a master. It's through the integration or through the process of vertical integration, right, is one way to do that. And vertical integration is when you own all levels or the phases of production to continue to skim those costs and reduce the bottom line. So, what if instead of buying iron ore in bulk from an iron mine, instead you bought the iron mine and then you sold or at least provided that iron to your own company at cost? So what you do is you get in the business of being more self-sufficient in a way to reduce production costs. This chart right here uses the example of how a paper factory could ultimately try to do this. You own this paper factory, you are the best paper manufacturer in the land, you have produced more paper at less money than anybody, but you have this relentless commitment to increased economy. So every year the price of wood pulp goes up, the price of chemicals go up, transportation goes up. How can you find ways to continue to mitigate these costs? And that's where you come into ideas like vertical integration. What if instead of buying your chemicals, you bought the chemical company itself and you continued to then that lessens that cost? Or what if instead of buying the wood and the wood pulp from loggers, you bought the logging company? Again, what you would do is in these large scale terms, you're continuing to reduce your production costs. So vertical integration, the key to understanding this is by owning all phases of production, you are working to increase economy, right? So one modern example of how vertical integration can be seen, and I know you guys are probably watching a lot of Netflix right now, it has to do with Netflix, is that Netflix at one point was a company who delivered content. Well, first they started as a DVD mail order service, right? But then when they transitioned in 2007 to an online streaming platform, what they then had to go about doing is procuring content. That is, we got to get shows that people want to watch. And this was hard to do and expensive for Netflix. So they struck a deal initially with Stars where they got some content from them. But how do you get this kind of top level content that people want without paying billions and billions of dollars for it? I mean, just think about this. Right now, The Office is going to go off of Netflix at the end of the year. Friends, they paid something like $40 million to keep Friends for a year, right? So, how do you find ways to get top level content at not top level price? Well, one way you can see this is through Netflix originals. Instead of purchasing the content from, say, Sony or MGM or whatever, Universal Studios or Disney, instead, they've tried to, or not instead, but in addition, create their own content. They're trying to own the studio, own the production process to lessen their costs and increase economy. Another way to do this, though, is not through vertical integration, but through horizontal integration. Now, this is a little different of a strategy. While vertical integration tries to push down and reduce production costs, what horizontal integration does is try to push up the prices, the market prices. That is what you can sell steel for, or in this case, what you can sell paper for. Now, what we know, or at least through the kind of capitalistic vision of America, is that competition truly brings down prices for consumers. That's why we are anti-monopolistic, really, as a society, or at least we've been cautious, and that goes back to this period. So competition ultimately is bad for businesses in some ways. In one way, it does breed them to be innovative and forward thinking and change. But on the other hand, if you have competitors that are pushing your costs down, they're always threatening your profit margin. That is that if you sell a hot dog for $1 and someone else sells it for 50 cents, that is going to continually put pressure on your business to get closer to their price, or else people just go to the 50-cent hot dog stand. So in this case, what horizontal integration tries to do is lessen competition. And that is, if I am a paper company and we're really good at this paper making process, we've vertically integrated, we've brought in ideas like automation, we've focused on increased economy, we've got that good management structure, we're bringing in technical innovation into the process to lower those production costs, we've invested in economies of scope and scale. How then can we keep competitors, though, from continuing to push our market price down? That is, what we sell the paper to the business or the consumer. Well, one way to do that is through lessening competition. In horizontal integration, what that tries to do is consolidate industries. That is, by buying out your competition, by bringing them under the umbrella of your company, you control more shares of the marketplace, right? A master at doing this was a man by the name of John Rockefeller. What Rockefeller tried to do was, like Carnegie, he was relentlessly committed to increased economy. There is this one story where he threatened to fire a manager of a factory unless he could find this missing bag in inventory of like 500 corks. So this must have been $1 worth of materials in a multi-million-dollar business. And he was saying, you better find this or you're fired, right? Is that relentless commitment to lowering production costs and that kind of accountability by management. So where Carnegie really is the example of how to vertically integrate, right? Because he bought the iron ore mines, the ships that sold them, the coal mines, right? He was really one of the innovators in vertical integration. John Rockefeller was an innovator in horizontal integration. There's 3 phases of how you can see horizontal integration pan out in what will be called Standard Oil Trust in the end, which is his company, Standard Oil Company. And I want you to know about these 3 phases and these kind of 3 evolutions of this philosophy. So we're taking notes right now. We've written down notes on horizontal integration, about trying to push market prices up by lessening competition. You do that by buying out your competitors, ultimately, with the goal of creating a monopoly, or at least being such a large force in that marketplace where you dictate the terms. Think of companies like Apple and Samsung. they hold such a large share of the phone marketplace that while there are other competitors like HTC and Google, they kind of just have to listen to the big boys, and they set the terms of the price of phones, contracts, marketplaces. It's really a powerful tool. Um, so when we think of Rockefeller, what one thing he did initially, and these early businessmen, they started trying to create pools. And that is, a pool are these sort of handshake agreements by companies. So think of maybe two gas stations across the street from each other. Well, if one gas station puts its price 10 cents lower than the other gas station, everybody's going to drive to the cheaper gas station. And then the other company lowers theirs, and they keep battling back and forth. Prices keep going down. The consumer is happy, but the businesses are not making the money they're hoping to. So, what if they made an agreement? And that agreement was, we're going to sell gas for the same price. And we'll beat each other on different things, whether it be service or the type of gas or the type of products we sell in the gas station itself. But here we're going to make an agreement, that this is the base that we are going to sell products for, right? Well, handshake agreements, this worked for a little while, but the problem is what happens when one company quits its agreement or backs out on it because of circumstances dictated. I like to think of it as this. Say there are two hot dog vendors in downtown Greenville across the street from each other. They both agree that them selling hot dogs at $1.50 is best for both of them. So neither one of them will sell it below $1.50. That works great for a month or two until one of those people has car problems, or maybe their child is sick and they have to miss work. So they really want to push up their sales quick, like in a hurry. So they say on Tuesdays we're doing dollar hot dogs, and then before you know it, next week they're doing dollar hot dogs every day of the week. And now their across the street competitor has to bring down his hot dog prices to continue to compete. So the pools were the first innovation in this, right? Is the pools, but they were not these very, very strong kind of entities. Is that they showed what the goal was, which is to regulate and control market prices, but they didn't work as well as potentially these businessmen had hoped. And this isn't the best slide on this, because what this is starting to, this implies that the pools brought about the Interstate Commerce Act and the Interstate Commerce Commission. But what we're starting to see is that ideas about competition and market regulation or market manipulation by companies are becoming a big deal. So what you then see, the next evolution of vertical integration, of horizontal integration, is the formation of the trust. Now, trusts are like a pool in theory, except for they're not handshake agreements. Instead, the company outright buys the competitor out. So they own both hot dog stands, and by reducing that competition, they're able to manipulate or at least control market prices for that object. Now, trusts at this time, what they become are very big, giant, powerful corporations, and their reach, what we start to see is that when you get a company like an Apple, and I'm not trying to dog a company like Apple or Google, but when they're so big, when they have, Apple is right now capitalized at over $1 trillion. So that means that company has $1 trillion worth of assets to build off of. Now that's probably changed after the dip in the stock market at this time, but they can, if they need to go set up a new data farm, if they need to take wine and dine the president or some senators or fly to New Zealand and talk to regulators there. They have the resources and the assets. So what this does is that Standard Oil, which at one point by Ida Tarbell was called a perfect trust because it was such a giant force in the oil industry, it really could control not only the market but the politics surrounding this this business or this industry. So if you look at this political cartoon, you can see a Standard Oil Trust has become such a big business, not even just a national business, but an international business. If you think about it in today's terms, is what we should be thinking about with businesses. But now businesses weren't just influential in their local region. They were influential throughout the country. And I think if you see this, the White House or Capitol Hill, or how you've got these politicians, they've got their tentacles on everything. So the question is, and we'll see this in later lectures as we get to the progressive era, what happens when business itself is bigger than society or the government regulations? What does that, try to do? So think about this. Horizontal integration is trying to consolidate industries. That's the goal. Consolidate industries, lessen competition. There were three evolutions in this process: the pool, then the trust. Now, we will get to this in a later evolution, in our later discussion about the progressive era and regulating businesses, because that's kind of a different, we're taking the angle of why did businesses grow and how did they grow and how did it change society, rather than what did we think about it at the moment. But that next evolution is the creation of a trust. So think a trust is a monopoly, right? It's another term that we kind of use. But a trust is when one corporation buys all the little industries. So if you have all the smaller companies, right? But you'll see that America and our kind of taste or disdain for monopolies will come to a head around the turn of the 20th century. You get Teddy Roosevelt, the trust buster. So there will be a point where the Interstate Commerce Commission will, work to say that certain monopolies are illegal or that they are problematic. So before that, as that happens, there will be a next phase, which has to do the holding company. And that is, if you can't outright own an entire sector, how can you maybe get those same principles or reach those same goals by the letter of the law? And what you'll see is this is holding companies come about. So a monopoly is when, say, I own all the companies in one sector. Think like, and we have no choice. There is no competition. What holding companies trying to do is not eliminate competition outright, but by increasing your influence. So what you'll see is something like this. If John Rockefeller couldn't own all the oil companies outright, so if they all couldn't be consolidated, or most of them consolidated under Standard Oil Trust, because they're going to bust that up, right? The trust buster. What if you owned a strong portion of the company, though? So what if you bought a significant share in its stock, right? Could you then exert influence on the board of directors, where you don't own the company, but you have influence? So this becomes the kind of loophole to get around the Interstate Commerce Act, the Interstate Commerce Commission, and the outlawing, or at least the regulation of monopolies, is you don't outright own the company, but you do own a portion of that company to where you can exert some influence maybe in decision making in that process. So to wrap up this part of horizontal, vertical integration, increased economy, horizontal integration, I like to use a modern example. And if we think about this, think of social media. Something that you use a lot is Twitter, Instagram, Snapchat, Facebook. And I think those are like the big four. I'm sure there's something else out there that I don't know about. But these, in theory, are individual, or at least they started as individual companies that were in competition with each other. So Twitter would rather have you on Twitter than on Facebook. Their goal is to get more and more people using their app. So what happens though when a company isn't competing in competition with, for instance, Facebook is in competition with Instagram and with Twitter? Well, in this case, what you can see is horizontal integration when Facebook bought Instagram and then incorporated it into its platform. Horizontal integration is the merger of two companies in the same part of the production supply chain. This may be in the same or different industries. The process can also be called lateral integration and is opposite of vertical integration, which allows companies to merge at different stages in production. So think Facebook now is no longer in competition with Instagram. Instead, when you're on Instagram, you are supporting the company of Facebook now. And now those two companies battle against Twitter, right? So what you can see is that as companies applied these strategies of vertical integration and particularly horizontal integration, these companies grew in scope and scale and influence. And this political cartoon is trying to say this is as these companies become so influential nationally and economically that their influence also extends into the realm of politics, right? Or and society. So how can we see problems or at least challenges coming down the road is that this was not something just done in the steel industry, but all industries started to use these blueprints of what they did in the steel industry, what they did in the oil industry, applying theories of increased economy, right? Economies of scope, economies of scale, vertical integration, and horizontal integration to grow the scale of their businesses. Now the question is though, is what are the effects that has on society and the people? And I think this political cartoon tries to address some of those things as or at least tease some of those out. If you look in the background, it says people entrance closed. And what this is saying, this is that the government was in many ways under the control or watch of these big giant trusts. So I think you can see some things coming down the line when it comes to that. Now, what I want to do is this: is I'm continuing to develop these ideas about how businesses were able to develop so well. And if you've seen, we've gone all the way through point 4, steel and new business structures. So you could even say steel, oil, and new business structures there. There's a lot there, right? That is a giant topic and will be the focus of one of your essays. But the next thing, remember, if we went back to the industrial equation, that the business of invention was also kind of an idea too. And that is that it said at one point the American Patents Officer said that America was home of the invention. Now, what I want to think about this is not only do inventions just grow industry, right? Because we saw how technological innovation improved industry. But I think actually that's where I want to focus on is how does innovation also, become a catalyst for business growth, right? And for economic expansion of the industrial era. Now, you saw this right away. You could say, hey, Bessemer steel process is a great example. Technological innovation, right? We've talked about the railroads. We've talked about how all of these innovations, whether it comes from the telegraph to the phone, right? But where can we find some commonalities on how innovation led to the expansion of business? And I want you to focus on one single concept, and that is the standardization of parts, right? And this is something that Americans have we're on the forefront of, and that is, how can we just do things better? Imagine if every house you lived in had different outlets for you to plug in the electrical socket. So, or what if every town had their own shape, right? It just wouldn't be very efficient. So, standardizing parts really helps the production process. And before you can standardize parts, you got to have the ability to do so. And one of the things that you see in innovations during this time is the ability just to create things with more precision on a mass scale. And one of the key innovations to this was the vernier caliper. What the vernier caliper allows you to do is measure to the thousandth of an inch, right? And what this does is creates a very precise measurement, right? And this is really important for producing things on a large scale that all are the same. So think about if you went and got a wrench and it said 9/16 and one wrench fit 9/16 bolts, but you got this other one and it was a little loose. So what the vernier caliper allows you to do is like produce screws that are all the same size or nuts that are all the same size. So where then you can really use math, right? Like math, like these, and become engineers in building things. So the vernier caliper, the key, and if you get this as an ID on your exam, has to do with the ability to standardize and mass produce parts. Here's an image right here celebrating this, and I think it can show you how standardization of parts really, lends to this topic. Is that at one point, not every railroad company used the same size rail. So think of this as where these guys are standing on are the rails. So what if one track was 4 feet wide and the other one was 6 foot wide? What would you then do is you would have to only use rail cars built specifically for that. They couldn't change from track to track or state to state. A great place to see this is actually in Europe. At one point, it was very difficult to travel from Madrid to Paris. In fact, you couldn't take one single train to do it because Spain, after World War II, is kind of taken over by this dictator, and they go into this isolationist type moment of their society. Well, what they did is they used a different style railroad tie, or rail size than the rest of European countries. So if you wanted to travel from Spain to Paris, you would have to take a train from Madrid, say, to the border, and then you would have to get off that train and then get on a French train. So American companies, and one of the first people to do, or earliest people to do this was in the railroad industry, where they standardize the size of the rail. So it doesn't matter what railroad car company is making it. They know, hey, it needs to be 3.5 foot wide or 4 foot wide, whatever the width is. Another great example of this goes back way earlier. And if you think of Eli Whitney with the cotton gin, another thing Eli Whitney was real big on was the standardization of parts. And he did this and in Springfield, Massachusetts, with muskets. And he tried to make the impression to Congress right before, during, I think this was before the Civil War. I mean, obviously it would be before the Civil War because cotton gin was 1793. But he brought this box of gun parts, unassembled gun parts, to Congress. He said, use whatever parts you want, put the gun together. They all work the same. Now, prior to that, if you broke the stock or the trigger broke on a gun, you would have to take that gun to a blacksmith. He would have to measure exactly each thing custom for that specific gun. Well, instead, you just say, hey, now, if you think about the ability now to measure precisely, produce things along a standard line, and all of a sudden, Now you just go to the gunsmith and you say the trigger broke, and he just sticks that trigger in. Or think about now the kind of gestation of this is that if your alternator goes out in your car and you go to Advanced Auto or O'Reilly's and you say, I need a new alternator, they don't have to come out to your car and take measurements and then send off for somebody to build that alternator. Instead, they ask you, what's the make, what's the model, and here is the standard part for that model. So think, innovation can really contribute to the development of increased economy, right? Think back, increased economy. If you when you think about innovation, you really can't think of anybody or it's hard to think of anybody other than Thomas Edison, maybe his rivalry with Nicholas Tesla. But Thomas Edison was an example of how innovation, just this kind of relentless commitment to innovating. Now, he might not fit into increased economy so much, but what you can see is that Thomas Edison shows how innovation can really push businesses to the next level. One of the places that he got his start was in Western Union. He was a telegrapher, and there's some great stories about him as a telegrapher. He left his home when he was 12 years old and declared himself grown. He was a very hard worker and brilliant in so many ways, but a very practical guy, right? Is that he wasn't interested in how black holes worked, or he lectured this one guy for saying, we're not German scientists who are interested in studying the fuzz on a bee. We are trying to make commercial innovations. So he had this eye for practicality, and his earliest inventions were in the telegraph area. He made a stock ticker. He made it so he was working at this company, and he saw things that could help the company. And he went and invested them, and then he ended up selling them all to Western Union. But one of the things that you could see if we go back to the standardization of parts and our thoughts about Thomas Edison is there was a rivalry between him and Nicholas Tesla. And really what comes out of that rivalry is AC and DC current, alternating current versus direct current. Well, AC current won in America, and if you go to Europe, they use DC electricity. So think about, in many ways, what you can see is that by standardizing parts, you as a company can really increase your economy. Go to production methods. Usually we go in a lot more into innovation, but I'm going to keep it scarce there. There are two last concepts. I'm going to skip over this right now. We're going to skip American consumption, and we're going to instead go to economic specialization and the mechanization of the workforce. And that will end our discussion for today about how we can increase economy. But think about this, is increasing economy also has to do with processes, right? It's not just strategies when it comes to scale and scope or vertical integration. But how can we increase economy in the smallest of areas? And when you think about that is mass production. Industrialization is not something to only be lessened or to be reduced to mechanization. So it's not just now machines do what humans did. Mechanization was an important part, but focusing on production processes and mass production, we've even seen those ties with standardization of parts, is an important component of this. And one of the places you see this is in specialization. And this actually has a lot of effects on the worker themselves. So when I give you an image right here, if you look at these three images, one is from a meat processing company, and the other two are from car manufacturing companies. I believe these images are from Ford. One of the things you do is you could work to specialize tasks and specialize as a company. So we do one thing really well. We've talked about how that's got some advantages, but we're trying to diversify our scope in a way. So we don't want to just, as a company, only do one thing and one thing only. But maybe in the production process, maybe you don't need to diversify too much. And the example of this, if you look at this top left image, is think about how you would get a hog from to the table ultimately before the industrial era. Well, some farmer would sell a hog to a butcher. That butcher would then slaughter the hog. He would hang it up, he would dress it, he would cut it, he would do all of that process from beginning to end. He, in many ways, as a butcher, had a skill, right? A trade where he was in complete control of the production process. Well, what we see is that companies during this time, in their effort to increase economy, instead are maybe starting to see the advantages in production on how to specialize the production process. So instead of having one guy do it from beginning to finish, here look, these guys all day long, all they do is split backbones. They take this big axe and they swing it and they split it. Then it moves down the line, and the next person might be the right leg dresser. On the other side of them is the left leg dresser. They only do one little thing all day. Another example is this bottom right corner, where these individuals are part of building a car, right? Is that you see on the bottom left, that's what the car looks like at the end. But these guys right here, all they do all day long are put spokes on a hubcap. That's all they do. So I think what you can see is some of these, the worker is actually getting less skilled in some ways. You're going from a butcher to a back splitter, or from someone who builds a car, which few people did, custom cars from start to finish. But think Wright brothers. They built the plane, they tested it, they flew it totally from scratch. To now you just work at a car factory and I'm really a hubcap spoke maker, right? So as you see this, what you can see is I like to focus on the meat industry because it's one of the hard places to mechanize. I actually found a very difficult time mechanizing the entire process. In fact, they never did. But specializing in the production process did allow them to focus on ways to increase economy. And here's a quote from one book on meat production during the time. It says, as late as the early 1880s, in some houses, the entire slaughtering and cutting operation was frequently done by one man, the all-around butcher. In the course of the workday, he would expect to handle a wide variety of animals in terms of size, weight, and quality of meat. He not only controlled the pace of work and conducted the whole slaughtering and cutting process, he made decisions about how that process should be done. So one man would do it from beginning to the end in the early 1880s. But by 1900, the job was still done by hand, so you couldn't mechanize the process. But the all-around butcher had been replaced by a killing gang of 157 men divided into 78 different trades, each man performing the same minute operation 1,000 times a workday. So hopefully you can see how specializing in not only parts but production processes is very critical to mass production and increased economy. The last thing I want to talk about when it comes to the focused on increased economy is the science of manufacturing, right? And that is the idea that these processes can be improved and perfected. And there is no better person to illustrate the attitude of this than Frederick Winslow Taylor. In his book, The Principles of Scientific Management, he outlines how production processes can be streamlined, improved, and standardized to increase economy. You know, it was in, I think, the late 1870s. I don't have my notes here at home, but early 1880s. Taylor walked into Bethlehem Steel with a stopwatch and a notepad, and he watched people work, and he measured the time it took to do all sorts of activities, whether it is to load this iron ore into the hopper or to shovel coal in. And he tried to identify places that could be improved and efficiency improved and productivity increased. And so what he did is he took a very scientific approach. That is, he went in, formed hypothesis, tested, retested, and then tried to seek the results he was looking for. And a great example, or one example of this, is that he ends up designing a series of new tools that he believed could increase not believe, but that did increase productivity. So instead of using one tool to do the same different tasks, what if you have a tool specifically made for a task? Can that speed up the process? Right? Another thing that he did is he also really focused on how do we define the way to do something rather than let the worker try to figure it out. So this is like where the genesis of employee manuals come from. This is the way it is to be done. You are to scoop, shovel, turn left, not scoop, shovel, turn right, because that will, in the next week, waste 18 minutes of your day, right? So defining what workers could and couldn't, how and how they shouldn't do things was a big part of this scientific management process. So think about scientific management. How can we look at the layout of a factory? How can we look at what workers are doing, when they're doing it, and how they're doing it to increase economy? Now, one of the results of this, though, or kind of I don't know if you would say a negative result, but in many ways did have a lot of impact on the workers, is that you really take away, by defining how you do this so specifically, you are making in many ways the worker a replaceable part, a standardized tool in production. So if you look at the cover, this is a cover right here of a reproduction or a reprint, a new edition of his book later on in the 20th century. And this worker is being replaced with a robot. They're not trying to say that we're replacing people with robots, but you're trying to make the worker a machine or a piece in a larger machine that does productivity, that continually focuses on increased economy. Now, there's going to be some wild results to this when it comes to, workers. Well, one thing is if that workers become interchangeable. So if you don't like the conditions, if you don't like the way it is, we'll fire you, bring someone in. And this really gives businesses a lot of influence and power over their workforce. But you'll also see that this does have a psychological effect on workers as well, is that when you go from someone who is a butcher, who is proud of a trade and has a skill, to just a backbone splitter, is that you've taken away a little bit of that. You've taken a lot of that trade away, and now they're just a worker. And so if you think about it from that perspective, there's going to be some ramifications. But in this case, principles of scientific management, read about it in your textbook. It has to do with organization of processes, right? And the standardization of processes and methods in a very scientific perspective to increase economy. Remember, all of this comes back to increased economy. So if we want to recap just a little bit of our entire discussion going back 2 weeks now, 3 weeks now, the whole point of the industrial equation is increased economy. That is, how do we produce more for less and increase profits? The industrial equation for profitability has to do with this. Let's expand production. Let's lower labor costs through industrial production, that is, mechanization, and keeping wages low. Minimize our costs as a company by economies of scale, buying in bulk, right? Getting rebates, business organization like vertical integration, maximize our profitability at the same time through strategies like horizontal integration, and always looking to get an edge in the future through reinvesting in new technologies. Think Bessemer Steel, that big gamble that he made in the 1860s, in the 1870s to win in the 1880s. And last, continue to refine, and refine through a very scientific perspective and scientific management, right? I know there's a lot to this and it's a complicated lesson, but this is going to kind of really conclude that. Now what we're going to kind of do in the next lesson is move on to what's the result of this socially. And that is, as businesses aggressively applied this industrial equation for profitability, what were the kind of ramifications that this had on society, and how did people react to these changes? Stay tuned for more. I'll try to chunk this a little bit as we go along and maybe clip this video up so you don't have to watch it all in one sitting. Remember, read your textbook, start reading your article for your next article review, and I will be getting you information on your upcoming exam.